Good morning. I'm delighted to be here to talk to you all about apprenticeship. And from my experience, what I've seen is I've travelled the world in different countries, from the UK to Australia to Germany and to Switzerland, looking at different models, different systems, and really thinking about what might be a fantastic opportunity, not only for the United States, but particularly for the state of Kentucky. And so my life started off as an apprentice. My father, like many parents, had ideas that I would be best suited to college. He was an academic and he did everything he could to dissuade me from following a career, learning by doing or learning and working with my hands. And so he sent me off to do work experience at his local university where he was working, and so I had an opportunity to do some work in the university cafeteria. Food's improved since there in university cafeterias, I must say, but back in the 70s and early 80s, things were pretty, things were pretty basic, and I really just couldn't see myself doing that as a career. And so I went back to school and I struggled along with class, a talking head at the front of the room. And I realised that I was not a student who was going to do well by memorisation and through tests. I was someone who wanted to get out, work with my hands. So I went off and became a culinary apprentice and ended up representing my country in the Culinary Olympics in Frankfurt in Germany. So apprenticeships really opened up a world to me, not just mastering a skill or occupation, but it taught me skills, life skills, skills that I use now every day as I talk to people about workforce and solutions and different things they can do to really connect school to work, to connect underrepresented groups to the employment market, to make sure that a region or a state or a country can be the best it can be and the people within that can reach its full potential. So I really wanted to have a conversation with you all and not just make this a talking head that I disliked so much at high school, and talk about what I've seen most recently with apprenticeship, because in the US you would have heard about the ambitions to create 5 million apprentices. The challenge is that there's some stigma around the word apprenticeship. Only in this country, I must say, if you go to the UK or you go to Australia or even cross the border to Canada and you say the word apprenticeship, people actually do think of IT, healthcare, banking, finance. Whereas in the US, if you ask people what they think apprenticeship means, if you talk to people in a restaurant or you're talking to people at a local high school or even a lot of careers advisors, what apprenticeship means, the first thing is they think it means low-skilled, low-quality work. They think they have ideas about it being specifically for building and construction, which has been great because about 80% of the country's apprentices now, registered apprentices, are in the building construction industry, 500,000 apprentices. But there's so many other opportunities for so many other occupations that can be apprenticed. I just wanted to talk about numbers and the opportunity and how the federal government arrived at the figure of 5 million. And although it was described by Mark Benioff from Salesforce as being this moonshot goal, and it sounds a long way from 500,000 to 5 million, in a country like Australia, there's 21 million people, and Australia has the same number of apprentices as the US does on a much larger population. One of the big challenges that I've seen is that there really isn't economies of scale. And what that means is it drives to inefficiency. There's a lot of confusion about how to take on an apprenticeship. If you're an employer, how to interact with the apprenticeship market. And so one of the keys to a successful apprenticeship system is easy access for employers, easy access for people who want to take on an apprenticeship, and connecting them to the workplace and connecting them to real jobs. I just thought I'd also just start with a little bit of definition around what an apprenticeship is and what an apprenticeship isn't. People often say to me, Nick, I've got this great apprenticeship program that I'm running. We're preparing people for work. We're putting them through intensive training. They come to the classroom, they're learning what it's going to be like when they head off to the workforce, and they do this 12-week intensive course. And at the end of that 12-week course, we place them out for 2 weeks, and then they've mastered an apprenticeship. That's not an apprenticeship. It's fantastic that a person is being prepared for the world of work, but an apprenticeship starts with one core principle. You must engage employers. If you don't have employers, the model doesn't work. It's about learning by doing and about earning and learning for the participants. So it can't just be a training program that leads towards work. It actually is work. It's real work in a real workplace, and it really is, to drive a sustainable apprenticeship program, you really need to look at some key success factors. You need to build in quality. You need to build in success standards and have very high standards which are going to stand up not only in your state, but also across the country, but also across the world. Because we are living in this age of globalisation and technological change. So whilst the state moves along and people go to work each day, the whole world is changing in the shape of work and what jobs might look like in the 21st century. So we want to make sure that in a robust apprenticeship program, we're not only building in the technical skills to get the job done now, we've got this other layer of what is called people skills or soft skills or world skills. These are the skills which are going to be transferable to any job. So even though the functions of a particular task might change, a robust apprenticeship program is going to teach people resilience, how to adapt to change, how to actually understand and interpret information, and how to use that moving forward. So I thought that's a great place to kick off, and maybe we might go to a question or two to really sort of set the scene and get into the dialogue.
So you've touched on this a little bit, but can you go a little deeper with how does the definition and perception of apprenticeship in the U.S. differ from other countries? And I guess some of the things that I'm curious about is, it seems to me like the term co-op or the term internship or the term apprenticeship is often used interchangeably. So I'm wondering if you can just go a little deeper and help us maybe clarify that so that we can use that with our various audiences.
Yeah, so I think that the definition of what an apprenticeship is, it's quite unique that in the United States, it's one of the only countries I can think of in the world that has or considers apprenticeship programs where you can actually call something an apprenticeship program that's not. The brand isn't protected. In Australia, in the UK, an apprenticeship must be 12 months in duration. The apprentice must be undertaking on and off the job training. There's all sorts of criteria that make an apprenticeship, and sometimes you hear these stories about things like internships. People say, Nick, are internships good or not? It really depends. Is the person being paid? Is it a real job? There's all sorts of questions about, is that going to lead to work? There's often questions about potential exploitation. Not all the time. There are some great internships, but there are some internships that really employers are probably not engaging in for the right reason. But the apprenticeship is really taking things to that next level down and starting a conversation with employers that goes like this. What is your skills need? What sounds pretty intuitive to ask an employer, what is your skills need? And then it's really about connecting the workforce and the different labour pipelines to that skills need. People often think, well, apprenticeship might only be for school leavers. We really need to look at the K through 12. We need to talk to these careers advisors who've got these myopic ideas about what a successful and rewarding career can look like. That there's a super highway to university, but for other students, an apprenticeship is kind of like the off-ramp. Maybe it's for the not-so-bright kids. But the reality is, the way that the world of work is changing, higher education, community colleges, high schools are all now having to work together in partnerships to adapt to this global change in really changing the way that education is being delivered. And so it's a very disruptive time that we live in. So I think that a model, a model such as an apprenticeship model, or particularly an intermediary type of model, really needs to have elements in it to be able to constantly adapt and adjust to the changes of employers. I must say, I talked about one pipeline being K through 12 school leavers and students. One thing that I've noticed, not just unique to the state, but right across the country, is quite often underrepresented groups are most definitely not accessing the apprenticeship market. Women, veterans, people with disabilities. Employers really need to, as it were, open their mind as to who they might employ. And I think that apprenticeship is one way that people can actually be prepared for the world of work and really create a pipeline into their businesses. So that's another really interesting way. Of course, this globalisation and particularly technological change is really having impact on a lot of industries, and we've seen mining industries, some older style manufacturing industries literally go away overnight, and that's going to continue to happen. We saw everything go online, and now online is actually under pressure because of 3D printing. Are people going to be able to print at home? So whilst all this change is constantly happening, what can we do? What are the levers within our education systems, within our school systems, and also how are we basically looking at the different cohorts and saying how can we connect them to the world of work? How can we connect them to the skills that employers actually need? So that's really one of the things that I really wanted to hit home, that apprenticeship is not the silver bullet, it's not the be-all answer, but it is definitely a proven model that can be adapted to any region, to any community and to any industry in a very versatile way. So the next question is, what's the best way for employers to access the apprenticeship programs?
Thank you. So I guess a second question that I would have, in your book, Job you have a copy of it there. I wanted to ask, what would you say to parents who are also resistant to the idea of a certificate holder as opposed to college? How do you dissuade them that, in fact, holding a certificate is a closed door? What do you say?
Well, I think one of the things that through my research, and I should say I'm actually not an academic, so I didn't follow in my father's footsteps. I'm really what would be described as a practitioner. So I practice what I preach. I actually employ, through my intermediary organisation, 750 apprentices and place them out with business and industry. And my organisation over the last decade has graduated nearly 17,000 apprentices. And that's into all sorts of different industries. And some unique things about that program is that 87% of people who start the program finish. One of the things that you'll hear about community college, or you'll hear about all sorts of education, is the incredible dropout rates. Parents are often causing this because they're pushing their children, their son or daughter or grandparents or whoever it might be, giving advice, some curbside advice to a young person, is saying, this is where you're going to have a rewarding career. Accounting, legal, these are the jobs. These are the jobs that are going to go into the millennia where you can go to college, you can go to 4-year college, you can graduate, and you'll automatically step into a 6-figure salary. The fact is that those jobs have gone away. Disruption is really impacting, I mentioned 2 industries there. Accounting. There's now apps where people can access an app for tax. They can file their tax return on an app. Does that mean that all jobs in accounting are going away? No. It just means that those jobs are changing, are going to be constantly adapting. So a lot of employers are now talking to universities and talking to their community colleges about executive education, about this idea of keeping people in this lifelong learning cycle. So heading back to the question, is what should a parent, or what sort of advice, or what should they be thinking? I think it really is opening up the possibilities as to what might be available in the area or in the region or in the industry. There are different ways to access industries now. A large organisation in technology, traditionally, the only way to access that company was with a 4-year college degree. Why? That was the status quo. That was the way it's been done for the last 5 years, the last 5 years before that, and then the last 10 years before that. And that is not the way that this company feels that it competes. It wants to bring in people from all sorts of different educational pathways. So there's some very innovative models and school models now around where apprenticeship is being introduced into high schools, so that you're not undertaking your full apprenticeship in the high school, but you're at least getting to understand these are the occupations and these are some of the different pathways. So it very much is not only educating the students, but it's actually educating parents and bringing them along as a part of the conversation. Now, one of the key things there is that whose responsibility is this? Is it the government? Should employers say to the government, we pay our taxes, it's your job to make sure that we have a skilled workforce? I think it's actually a shared responsibility. I absolutely believe that government has a role to play, but government needs to create an environment for employers to want to employ. And it really needs to say to employers, you need to come out and you need to engage in these programs. And I'm not talking about opening up a checkbook and writing out a cheque for the high schools award nights and saying that's my employer activities for the year, or maybe it might be sponsoring and showing up at a trade fair and setting up a card table and putting out some brochures. Maybe even to get the students to pick them up, they might even put some candy on them. And all you see as the bus drives out of the career fair, you see the brochures flying out of the bus window as the students are trying to get the candy off the wrapper. The fact is that students don't actually, surprise, surprise, don't get information from flyers. They don't even get it from the internet or websites. It's from a mobile phone. It's from apps. That's where students are understanding, well, these are the opportunities. So it really is turning everything on its head and saying, how can we re-educate different groups? How can we connect with schools? And we shouldn't say apprenticeship is the only way or four-year college is the only way. The fact is, if you look to some robust economies like Switzerland, they actually have a dual system where people actually move between the vocational and academic tracks. I've met people who started apprenticeships and end up with a PhD and vice versa. So I think that the message has to be there's this pressure as you travel through high school, even getting into high school, as you travel through high school, if I don't get into that college that everyone's told me, if I don't get into that college, the world is going to end for me. My opportunities are going to shrink. I think we really need to change the language, and we need to bring along the media, and we need to have conversations like this and really spread the word about other opportunities that are available and just instill this idea of lifelong learning, be it the displaced worker or be it the person who is entering the labour market from school, who had a bad start and slipped through the cracks and maybe needs a school to work or a job readiness program to bring them up to speed.
So I'm curious, you mentioned the term intermediary. Can you talk to us about what that is and how that fits in an apprenticeship program? And is it just one model, many models?
There are several apprenticeship models that are successful around the world for engaging apprentices in large numbers and scalability. And one of the concerns that I see, particularly as you travel across the country, and is that a lot of smaller companies have difficulties accessing workforce programs. They're actually just trying to do what they do. They don't have time to fill in forms and administration and think about if I take on an apprentice, where are they going to be trained? And what is the wage and conditions for an apprentice? And so all these barriers start to build up in their minds, and they end up having a desire to engage, and they realise that they need to think about bringing in the next generation of workers into their company, remembering we've got this ageing population, this ageing workforce. They want to do it, but they can't see an easy mechanism. Some smaller employers might take on an apprentice, they might take the leap, they take on an apprentice, but they don't have the support network around them. What happens if they feel that the apprentice's performance isn't up to scratch? What happens if the apprentice doesn't show up to work one day, has some emotional or relationship-related issue. How do they deal with that? And all these things compound, and maybe that apprentice drops out and they're lost to the system. So one opportunity is using an intermediary who can really be a safety net and simplify access to the system for small to medium employers. So one way could be through a workforce board. You could collect a whole lot of small and mid-sized companies who might want to employ 1 apprentice here and 3 apprentices there and 5 apprentices here, and bundle them up into manageable clusters of 100 apprentices in one group. They might be in 2 or 3 streams. So you might have an advanced manufacturing stream, or you might have a hospitality services stream, or you might have an engineering or a coding stream. You then talk to the employers and say, what is your skills need? Work out what are the pathways. And so this intermediary can then organise and provide a lot of these services that an employer would have to do directly. So that would be, they would pay the apprentice. They would organise the administration. They'd help customise the program for the employer. Some employers are looking to take on workers to actually create competitive advantage. They want to build in their staff things that other companies can't duplicate and replicate, because everybody can buy the same aircraft in this country. There's 2 or 3 manufacturers. Everybody lands at the same airports. But why is it that some airlines outperform others, and that you as consumers say, I want to fly this airline over that airline? And the reason is it's human capital. So it's no different in these other industries. So employers are investing. So there's all sorts of different activities which would all be moved into the intermediary. And the number one activity that the intermediary undertakes is mentoring. They would provide mentoring to the apprentice to make sure that we don't only get them a job, but they actually keep a job. Because there's no use having 75% of people who start an apprenticeship drop out. You want to drive to 75 plus completion. And the only way to do that is to allow each apprentice to have a one-on-one mentor. And sometimes people say, but Nick, there is a mentor in the workplace, that's the boss. No, the boss is a supervisor, is not a mentor. The mentor is a person who can work as an intermediary between the employer, between the community college, because quite often apprentices are so charged up to get into the workplace. They see all this excitement in this world that's suddenly opened up to them. And the thought of actually doing the off-the-job training, be it in a community college, that's a bit boring. I can't see how that's relevant. I just want to get on with the job now. The apprentice mentor makes sure that the apprentice actually attends and undertakes and completes that part of college. So how is this wonderful system funded? It's actually funded by employers. The employers are paying an apprenticeship wage, and all they're doing is simply the intermediary charges a management fee. It might be a 6, 7, 8% management fee, which the employers are quite happy to pay, because they know they're accessing apprenticeship programs, and if things don't work out, they ring the industry liaison or the mentor, and they simply hand the apprentice back. But that apprentice isn't lost to the system. They're just going back to the intermediary to be replaced with another employer. So it's a way of keeping the apprentices together. It's a way of managing, because quite often, why does an apprentice fail? It could just be a conflict of personalities between the apprentice and the supervisor. Does that mean that that apprentice is no good in that industry? Absolutely not. But if there isn't an intermediary or a safety net to catch that apprentice, particularly if we're talking youth apprentices, that person is told they're no good, they're not suited to that industry, and they'll leave. And they'll wander off down the path and they're lost to the system. That worker is in most times is able to be taken back to the intermediary. Look at what were the issues. Was it behavioural issues? Was it some other underlying issue? Maybe there might be some, it might be some drug-related thing, which is, the scourge of not only this country but many countries. What can be done? So maybe that apprentice might need to get some additional offline support. So they're taken out of the program. They might need to go and get some counselling, specifically to get them back to the start line, to be able to recommence their apprenticeship and do what they want to do, which is gain a qualification, which is going to be stackable, which is going to be able to be used for other jobs. And I should say, we haven't talked about apprentice pay, but I think that people really need to look at the earning capacity of an apprentice. So this is now talking to parents or grandparents. I think people really need to say, well, this is a very low debt way of gaining some skills and gaining some qualifications. So the average wage of apprentices continue to push up well beyond $50,000. It really depends on the industry. And so I think there's so many opportunities for people to engage with the market, but the intermediary is definitely one proven model. And back to the Australian example, about 80,000 apprentices are clustered together in the intermediary services. It could be by geographical location, or it could actually be by industry. I mean, if a state or a city has enough apprentices in a particular area, it might be in and around engineering in 3 or 4 occupations, or in automotive, it might actually make sense to say, let's have some sort of group apprentice scheme for the automotive industry in Kentucky.
I'm curious as to what other countries are doing as far as when they're deciding to engage people, because you mentioned youth apprenticeship.
Yeah.
And so there's been a lot of discussions here, at least in Kentucky, about when it makes sense to engage someone into an internship and what the success rate is, as well as also assessing their skill set to make sure they're going to be successful in that internship or apprenticeship, if you will.
Right, so as far as what other countries are doing and can that be airdropped, as it were, people have probably heard a bit about the apprenticeship systems in Germany, and there is no question that the apprenticeship system in Germany is very robust. I've worked in it, I've visited it, I've looked at it from an academic perspective, but there is no one system that can be brought to the United States or that can be brought to Kentucky that can just be slotted straight in and it's automatically going to work. So what really needs to happen and what actually is happening, and you've probably noticed my accent, I'm not from around these parts, that the state is looking to other countries and saying, what are the key elements that we could bring together in a coordinated way, resequence things and look at things that are already happening on the ground? Because one thing that really has struck me about the state is there are so many solid initiatives already underway. And this apprenticeship program is not saying, let's get a piece of paper and start this whole thing again. There is flexibility. So if there is a program that is connecting people to the world of work, could that lead into an apprenticeship? And how could that be readjusted so that that actually leads to apprenticeship? There might be a program that is actually an apprenticeship that just needs a little bit more structure, a little bit more rigour, a little bit of organisation and some tweaking, and that actually can be an apprenticeship program. There might actually be some companies who, for whatever reason, decided not to register their apprenticeship program, who can now see that times have changed, that we're not just talking about apprenticeships in building construction or one particular industry, and they might say, you know what, I think there's benefits to actually engaging with an intermediary or bringing my apprenticeship program into the registered system. So there's a lot of different ways that people can access the program. To your question, people are coming from all different perspectives, but there is a minimum start line for an employer. This is based around an employer's skills need. So employers need to make sure that people who are starting an apprenticeship are going to show up. Quite important for employers. It's not a big list for employers. Show up, be interested, ask some questions, have some curiosity. That's what employers are looking for. They're not looking for this incredible skill set. And if they are, they're actually not looking for an apprentice. They're looking for a qualified worker, and they're unrealistic. And maybe that's where an intermediary can actually say to them, you know, you actually need to build a solid pipeline. You can't just wave a wand. Or as some people said, you can't just look online and see where I find unicorns and buy half a dozen unicorns and plug them into my business and say, I'm off and racing, I've now got a skilled workforce. So it's managing expectations from the employer, from the individuals. But all sorts of different programs need to get people to the start line of apprenticeship. Some may be way away from the labour markets. It might be somebody who's been incarcerated. They're going to need extra assistance to be able to get to that start line. There might be some schools that have some wonderful, what used to be called, I suppose, shop class or vocational. I better not use that word. Some people come and say that's a bad word. It's a bad word, Nick. But it could be that there's a modern version of shop class that might be involving STEM. That means that student is going to leave high school and be very, very close to the start line of what employers need. And all that would need to get that person from the high school into an apprenticeship is maybe just a little bit of tweaking of the program within the school, and that person is ready to start. But I think we've got to say, how can we bring in all these other groups? People with disabilities. I mean, there is a huge opportunity to rethink what that actually looks like, and I think that's another area of a huge underrepresented group that we can say, how can we engage those folks and get them engaged in a productive way? Not in a philanthropic way, not in a, we're doing the right thing by employing someone with a disability. An employer says, I have work that needs to be done and I'm open-minded about who I might employ. So I think that, I've flown the flag for apprenticeship and waved the flag enough, but if people wanted to interact with me, they can always tweet me, Nicholas_Wyman. That's a great way to engage with me, or I've got a website for my book, and I like to talk to people about what's going on in their region or their communities.
I have one final question for you for our time today, and that is, the question that we get most often out in the field is, what about the ROI? What about the return on investment as an employer? Can you speak to that briefly?
So there's a lot of research starting to be done, and it's incredible that it hasn't been done over the years. There's a professor at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. by the name of Robert Lerman, or Bob Lerman, and he works at the Urban Institute. He's also got a website called the Institute for Innovative Apprenticeship, and he's written pretty extensively on the ROI. Put it simply, there absolutely is a return for employers, and it's a significant return, and it really depends on factors like the industry, but there is no question that by investing in apprenticeship programs, employers are going to be streets ahead. And a Harvard University professor by the name of Joe Fuller recently did some research which had some interesting findings about employers' preferences and looking towards who employers might want to employ and the different skills and qualifications. Are they just looking for university graduates, or are they looking for people who actually are able to be productive on day one? They've actually both at this start line. One of them has gone through a 3-year college program, one has gone through a 3-year apprenticeship program. Which one of those employees is going to be a better investment long term? And so Joe Fuller's research, I don't want to summarise an academic's research, gets me into all sorts of trouble, but check that out and I think you'll find some interesting findings there. So well worth looking into, and it's something that definitely the state could be involved in, and I think really spread the word to employers, because it is an important question. Because why am I, as an employer, going to invest? We don't want employers to invest because they feel it's the right thing to do. We don't want employers to invest because they heard there's some federal government funding available and they might be able to start an apprenticeship program, because we know from history, not an academic's point of view, this is called the real world practitioner's view, as soon as that funding, the tap is turned off, 9 times out of 10 those programs fail. You need to make sure that any government funding or any seed funding is used to enhance a program, not to start buying and building infrastructure. Because if you are leasing office space and putting in place with government-supported funds all these initiatives and all these different activities, as soon as that funding stops, as soon as the political landscape changes, your program's going to be under threat. So sustainability is something I think a lot about and I work with employers about, and it really is saying to employers, you people need to invest. Not everyone's going to be willing. Some employers are going to be a bit hesitant. Don't worry about those guys. They're going to be the ones who are going to kind of knock on the door and say, we don't have a skilled workforce. Well, You could have gone back 5 years and you could have started to invest in a workforce and apprenticeship program today. So I think it's really getting people who actually can see the future. And I must tell you, most companies I speak to are facing some sort of skill shortage. Just the national statistics you hear about, the skills gap, I call it people without jobs, jobs without people. 3.5 million people are sitting on the sidelines. 3.5 million people are actually looking for work, while you've got other millions and millions of people who are unemployed or underemployed. So people who the statistics might say, well, they're engaged, let's not worry about that group. There are folks out there who have a part-time job who realise they can't support their family. They can't put food on the table and a roof over their head with that part-time job, and they need to engage with the workforce. There's also constant policy changes at the federal level. That may have an impact. For better, for worse, relating to the policy, that's something for you to decide. But it changes the labour market at the local levels. It suddenly means that large numbers of people might have to re-enter the labour market. One final word is something that we'll all be quite pleased about is medical change. Medical change, I mean, it's just leaps and bounds and stem cell research and all these different activities. What it's actually doing is it's doing some strange things to the labour market. People are living longer. This is good news. I'm happy about that. I don't know if anyone's unhappy about that in the room. People are living longer. The whole retirement world isn't the same. All these fund managers sit in New York and they're going, this isn't going to work anymore. What are we going to do? People actually need to stay in the workforce longer. So once again, another huge underrepresented group is people who are about to leave the workforce and be lost to the workforce. How can they be re-engaged back into the workforce? So that's something that I'm also passionate about. I know I said I'm passionate about apprenticeships and passionate about a lot of things, but I really look forward to continuing the conversation, and it's been great to come and talk to you this morning. So thanks for having me.